Hey everybody.
Hi.
Thank you for coming out tonight to Flyleaf Books and supporting your local independent bookstore. Your attendance and book purchases let us have these events and we really appreciate them. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from Chris Cooper as he presents Anatomy of a Purple State with David A. Graham. Christopher A. Cooper is the Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs and the director of the Hare Institute for Public Policy at Western Carolina University. David A. Graham is a staff writer at The Atlantic, based in Durham, and he teaches journalism at Duke University. We hope you enjoy, and remember you can grab a copy of Anatomy of a Purple State up front at the registers after the reading if you have not already. You can also, if anyone didn't get it signed, I'm sure you can grab Chris and get it signed as well. All right, over to y'all.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Alex. Chris, it's great to be here. It was great to read this book, sort of get me, make sure I knew what I was doing ahead of this election, so it's been helpful for me. And if you can speed read it in the next few days, you will be more ready on Tuesday as well. So I recommend that. I do hope we can find something to talk about in North Carolina politics right now. I don't know. It's going to be challenging. I want to maybe start with a little light audience participation.
Yeah.
How many of you in the audience were born in North Carolina? So that was even more dramatic than I expected. But what does this tell us about North Carolina politics today?
That's a perfect illustration. First of all, thanks David for coming out here and doing this. I really appreciate it. And thanks to y'all for coming out on a random Tuesday night. I think what it tells us is this is a changing state, right? And that many of the things that we think we know or thought we know about our state are changing right kind of before our eyes. And we're a state dominated increasingly by these unaffiliated voters. And so like with my class, I do a similar kind of like raise your hand deal. And nobody has ever like kept their hand down when I say, are you registered unaffiliated, right? It's like young people, newcomers to the state are overwhelmingly unaffiliated. That doesn't mean, of course, that they don't have partisan preferences. They do. But I still think it fundamentally, it means that the nature of our state is changing. It also means like at a base level, we've got Rachel Hunt, right, running for lieutenant governor. And a lot of the pitch is, hey, she's Jim Hunt's daughter. Well, the folks who didn't raise their hand, that might not mean quite as much, right? So even the kind of campaign rhetoric that we're seeing, the kind of people you trot out, I think it's all changing, and what counties are competitive, what counties are not competitive. I think it's all kind of a new ballgame.
So this is maybe a little obvious, but might be useful to define terms. This is called Anatomy of a Purple State. What do we mean when we say that North Carolina is a purple state?
Yeah, so this is marginally funny. I think it's funny. Well, maybe y'all will. I had my wife read part of this book, and she's like, why are you so defensive about the fact that it's a purple state? She's like, chill out, man. And I think the reason is because North Carolina is a purple state, at least in my mind, that hasn't done a lot of swinging, right? And so the last time we voted for a Democrat for president of the United States was 2008 with Barack Obama. The time before that was when we voted for a guy who just turned 100 last week. So it has been a minute, right? But I think the point to me is that you can be a purple state and not have done much swinging. So a purple state is a state that is positioned somewhere in the middle of the country when it comes to electoral results, when it comes to public opinion, when it comes to any of these kind of indicators we have. And so you don't necessarily need to swing to be considered purple, right? It's a book in some ways about margins more so than it's a book about winners and losers.
So there's an interesting historical thread that you trace in this book, which is that for decades, this was basically a one-party state. And it was known for its kind of relative moderation and good feeling. And now the state is roughly evenly divided. And yet the politics are totally vicious and bare knuckle. Why is that the case? What has happened what about the sort of structure of the state lends itself to that?
Yeah, I think this is one that's maybe a little bit counterintuitive, right? So what makes us competitive is the same thing that makes us so cutthroat, so no holds barred, so knives out, if you want to borrow from the movie, right? So the idea is if you are the Republican Party in Oklahoma, you can slow roll this thing for a decade, right? Like you're gonna be in charge. There's no need to act quickly or with haste. If you're the Democratic Party in California, like you got this thing. If you are either party in the state of North Carolina, you might lose the next election. And so you need to act quickly. You need to act with haste. You need to change and alter this very structure of government to try to make sure that you can exercise that power when you have it. So the thing that makes us competitive, we would hope in this sort of fantasy land, that would make us a more moderate state in terms of government policy. It actually makes us the opposite.
And when does that start?
So it really starts with the big switch after 2010, right? So 2010, for those folks who don't know, we got some folks who worked on some of these campaigns probably in 2010. But this was, in my mind, the most important election in modern American history. That we tend to think about presidential elections, and yeah, they sure matter, but 2010, the Republican Party did something really smart. So the Democrats are pretty high on themselves. They're feeling good. Barack Obama's president. They're doing well at the federal level. And the Republicans realize, hey, we can flip state governments for a lot less money and a lot easier. And if we do that in 2010, guess what we get to do in 2011? We get to draw new maps, right? We get to draw new maps that will then lock in these majorities. And they gave it a really hard name to figure out called Project Red Map, right? It's pretty clear what they were trying to do. They were not hiding the ball. It was incredibly successful. And so they flipped something like 600 state legislative seats across the country. They flipped a ton of chambers. That then locked them in to be able to redraw maps in 2011 and then pushed a lot of the power of the government from the federal level to the state level. So I think it was really the most consequential election we've seen in a long time, and that is the exact same time that this happened in North Carolina, right, where you get these, obviously we have a Democratic governor right now, and we've got a supermajority General Assembly, and so those are the exact kinds of margins I'm talking about.
When there are stories about these vicious politics, you often, you have critiques of the Republican majority in the General Assembly, and their answer is usually, well, look, the Democrats did all of this first.
Yeah.
And another thing you trace in the book is that is by and large true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So think about redistricting or gerrymandering. So 1949, this whole political scientist named V.O. Key, I wasn't so old then. But anyway, he wrote a book called Southern Politics and State and Nation that political scientists love to quote, and so I'm going to love to quote it right now. And he talked about the Democrats who had cut what he called bacon strip districts from west to east across the state, smothering all the Republican votes. So they made sure we had 0 Republicans in the United States Congress as a result of gerrymandering. And it's exactly what it was. And so when the Republicans took over, in 2010, they were able to do it more successfully for reasons we can certainly talk about, but it was the exact same thing the Democrats were doing before.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What are those reasons?
So, I think one reason, people tend to look at computers and they say, okay, it's a lot easier. You can get on Dave's redistricting app. If you're a big nerd, you understand that. If you're not, it's this free program where you can draw your own state legislative districts or congressional districts. But I think the bigger thing folks don't talk about is that voting patterns are increasingly defined by geographic location, right? So it is easier to draw a gerrymander because because it can be more reliable, right? You don't have to slice through a certain neighborhood or grab a block. You know that whole parts of town or whole cities tend to lean towards one party or the other party, and people tend to vote more and more and more consistently. So it's just easier to draw a gerrymandered map as a result. And then you add to that the decline of the VRA. The decline of the VRA, which essentially meant that the state governments didn't have to go to the federal government to ask permission before redrawing maps. And you kind of put all that together and you get some very, very effective gerrymanders.
You touched on this a little bit ago, but one of the major themes of this book is the importance of unaffiliated voters. Where have they come from and why do they matter?
Yeah, so unaffiliated voters are the largest group in North Carolina politics. So we created them in 1978 in the state of North Carolina. We had all these other categories called independent and a few other things. We said, all right, let's combine them and create this category called unaffiliated. And for a whole long time, nobody took advantage. A rounding error from nobody took advantage of it. And the reason is that the parties lock unaffiliated voters out of their primaries, right? So structurally, why would you disenfranchise yourself and become an unaffiliated voter and say you're not going to vote in primaries? Nobody did it. And the Republican Party gets really, really smart. They're probably very smart before, but they execute that smart. And they say, we're getting killed in terms of party registration. What if we open our primaries to the unaffiliated voters? And they did, and it worked. And so if you have a graph in there, you can sort of see at that point the sort of Democratic numbers decline. You can see unaffiliated grow, and you can see Republican grow. It was like it's like a bad drug dealer. Like, come try us, and after a while, first one's free, and then we'll kind of keep you with our party for a while. And it took the Democrats 8 years before they finally opened up their primaries. So you had this period in the middle where if you were unaffiliated, the Republican Party said, welcome, and the Democratic Party gave you the Heisman. And so it had the intended effect. And then unaffiliated goes through the roof. 2017, it crosses Republican to become the second largest group in the state, crosses Democrat just this last year to become the largest group. So who are they? They are younger. The easiest, cleanest way I know to think about it is if you are under 45, it's the largest group of registered voters in the state. Over 45, the smallest group. Born in state, it is the smallest group. Born out of state, the largest group. And you don't have to be a demographer to figure out which ones of these are on the increase, which ones of these are on the decrease. The hands told us the story just a few minutes ago, right? So why do they matter? And this is where I get into smart disagreements. Well, their part's smart, mine probably isn't, but smart disagreements with political consultants. Political consultants often will say, why do I care about unaffiliated voters? All I care about is how they're going to vote and who's going to win the next election. And I get that. If that's where your bread is buttered, that makes all kinds of sense. But the reason I think they really matter, sort of this big buildup, is it's the largest group in the state. They have a chapter about how they essentially never win office, and we can talk about why that is if folks want. So you've got largest group in the state, but they never win. So to run and to win and to represent us, you can't be a member of this party. And so if young people and people moving to the state are unaffiliated, if you have to be a member of a party to run and to win, then who's going to be left to run for office in 20 years? Right? I think it's a real ticking time bomb for the state of North Carolina and for how we think about democracy, right? We need people to run for office. We need Republicans to run for office, Democrats to run for office, particularly more women, people of color, all these things that we have underrepresented. Well, we're going to get a smaller and smaller pool of potential people to run for office. And I think it's a real long-term problem for the state. I say as a registered unaffiliated, who will not run for office.
And you point out also there's all sorts of other besides candidates. There's things like election judges. There are boards of elections members. Right. There are all these places that are specifically laid out as partisan. And if these people aren't partisan, they can't serve in those capacities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So our state board of elections and all 100 board of elections, the party of the governor gets one more seat than the other party. And you think, okay, well, the other party with the most members, that's unaffiliated. Well, that doesn't count as a party. So the only thing the two parties agree on, right, is that there should be two and only two parties. Right? Everything else, they don't agree on the same kind of beer to drink, like where to have dinner, anything, but they definitely do agree that we shouldn't keep these unaffiliated folks, give them much power at all. And so, you look at all the changes that just happened in the western part of the state with Helene coming in. We had 13 counties that were allowed to make some election changes. Every person who got to weigh in on those changes, either a Democrat or Republican, unaffiliated, had no power.
Do these folks turn out at the same rate as partisans?
They do not turn out at the same rate as partisans, although they're looking a little bit better this cycle. So we were talking before about, and you and I were emailing today, about early vote and kind of what it looks like. Republican voters are better right now. The unaffiliated percentage, though, is growing this time. So they always turn out less, but they appear thus far super early to be sort of bridging that gap in 2024.
And most of them are effectively voting as Democrats or Republicans, right?
That's right. So most of them, absolutely, most of them are what we call shadow partisans. But the way I like to think of them is, I don't know if this metaphor works or not, you can tell me later, as unmoored voters. And so you sort of imagine, like, if you're a member of a party, you're tethered to the dock and you're not going anywhere. And if you're an unaffiliated, you may be hanging out near that dock, but if there's a big storm for some reason, you may find yourself across the lake, right, if you buy my bad metaphor. So what that means is they're harder to control, and they can move. And so maybe the simplest way to think about it is most unaffiliated voters are not swing voters, but almost all swing voters are unaffiliated voters. And so it's where the action is.
You mentioned earlier that there's talk of North Carolina being a swing state, but we haven't really seen that at the presidential level, save in 2008. We'll find out in a week whether that changes. Why is it that Democrats can't seem to close that deal, despite all these sort of demographic predictions? And you look at the numbers, it seems like they should be able to, and they just can't. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, part of it's just mobilization, right? And so there's been a lot of ink spilled about Mecklenburg County in particular over the last couple of cycles, and I think there is something to that. I mean, if you think about, young people we know are much less likely to turn out to vote, period, right? They are less for a whole variety of reasons. So if young people tend to lean a little bit more left, and that is the exact group that's less likely to turn out. People of color are less likely to turn out for a variety of reasons, and we've seen that be even worse the last couple of cycles. So I really think the numbers are there for the Democrats. The mobilization has not been. And then you add a little bit, so you say Roy Cooper, like what's Roy Cooper's secret sauce? Which is magic formula, right? To win as a Democrat in this state that isn't swinging at the federal level. And part of it is we have the second most rural voters in the state of North Carolina, of the country in the state of North Carolina. Second most rural voters in the country after Texas. All right. So the most of any swing state, no offense to Texas, they ain't a swing state. So, or a purple state anyway. So
they keep trying there too.
I know, that's exactly right. Got some in-laws there that tell me some stories. They think Colorado's going to win. I think they're wrong. Anyway, so we have a large number of rural voters. What that means is you can't ignore the rural vote. So if you're in Georgia, you can't ignore the rural vote if you're the Democrats, but if you drive up, turn out in Atlanta, and you do pretty well in Savannah and Augusta, you're good. But if you add up the triangle and you add to Charlotte, you don't reach anything the size of Atlanta. So that means if you're the Democratic Party, you can't get killed in the rural areas. The one person who loses rural North Carolina, but by smaller margins, is Roy Cooper. And I think part of that is he's from Nash County, he is rural, he presents as he is, and I think that's sort of been his secret sauce.
So that's interesting. Thinking about the governor's race, where if the polls are accurate, Josh Stein is going to win by a decent margin. Yeah. What is his coalition going to look like compared to, we don't know what will happen, but what will his map look like compared to Kamala Harris's?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, right, so this is the $10,000 question: is what exactly does that coalition look like, and how much of it does he win by mobilization, or does he just win by ballot roll-off, right? So we had this conversation before, right? So ballot roll-off is the idea that you fill out the top of the ticket and then you just decide you're going to stop at some point and say I'm voting for Trump and then I'm getting out of there. I'm betting that's going to be a lot of what's happening here. A lot of the Republicans who are going to show up just aren't going to be able to stomach Robinson for whatever set of reasons. Okay, we know the reasons. So my guess is Stein is going to do much better in the urban centers, of course. I think he will probably follow roughly a Roy Cooper map. But let's remember, too, like Josh Stein, he's going to win. And he's going to win because Mark Robinson. But Josh Stein won by, less than 1% in the last election as an incumbent attorney general. So it's not like he's somebody who has shown, big victories in the past. He really hasn't. So I don't know exactly, it's not a great answer to your question, David, but I don't know exactly what that map looks like. But I think a lot of it is going to be, it's going to take a few days to figure it out because I want to see how much of it is which counties he's winning based on people dropping off or based on people coming over.
Now, I think I'm risking falling into one of the traps you described in the book, which is we focus a lot on the governor in a state where the governor has very little power compared to most states. So maybe we should talk a little more about the General Assembly. You say that people focus a lot on Washington. They have a lot of information about what's going on in Washington. They have much less about what's going on in Raleigh, even though it affects their lives more deeply. Maybe this is risk. This is going to be an educated Chapel Hill crowd, but let me give it a shot. How many of you feel deeply informed about the General Assembly? Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah. I knew it was going to bite me. Two audience participation questions is a mistake. But for the people who don't, how can we pay closer attention? What do we need to do to follow state politics more effectively if we're not a Flyleaf crowd?
That's a great question. So I try, maybe unsuccessful, but I try at the end of the book to actually give some suggestions about ways people can follow North Carolina politics because this crowd, clearly y'all are clued in. You showed up on a Tuesday to hear us yak about this stuff. But I think most people don't know. And when I talk to students, I think they really, they don't know who their state legislator is. So one thing to ask people, don't answer this part out loud, is, are you clued in? Yes, this crowd is. But even the people I talk to that say they're clued in, I say, what state house district are you in? What state senate district are you in? And who represents you? And even the wonky academics I hang out with, like, so Mike Clampett is my state house member, House District 119. Like, even in the political science department, I bet I'm the only person who can tell you that, right? So part of it is just awareness, right? Awareness that you should follow it, that it does matter. And then, try to give some sort of tips in the back. And the nice thing is we do have a healthy, I think, compared to most states' media ecosystem here. I say that also with the knowledge that it's not as healthy as it used to be. So we've seen a decline. I don't talk about this much in the book, but we've seen a decline in state house journalists, the number across the country. So we have now fewer than 500 folks covering state politics, 50 states. Wow. And then the numbers get even scarier from there. So years ago, I was working on a project about state house journalists where I just go interview them in different states. And I get to Wyoming and I met this really brilliant woman who was covering state politics. I'm like, how'd you do this? And she says, well, I got a master's at MIT in science writing. I said, well, how are you covering state politics now? And she says, well, I came out here to cover elk. And then they said, no, now you just go cover the state legislature when they're in session, right? So the numbers are bad. The expertise is sometimes not there too. But even with all that said, I think we do a better job than many of the other states around us. We do actually have a stronger than average state house press corps.
Do you think that's still true outside of the circulation range? It's a little bit of anachronistic in an online age, but outside of the range of the Charlotte Observer and the NO?
Yes.
You live outside that range, right?
I do. I live in Jackson County. It's hard to get much farther west than I live. You can do it, but you got to work at it. It is a problem, right? So study after study, I talk about this a little bit in the book, shows that the farther you live from the state capital, the less you know about state politics, right? Your water cooler conversations, the people you run into, you just know less. And so, the media ecosystem is different out there. At the same time, I think now that so much is online, I can't get the Asheville Citizen Times delivered to my door, period. It doesn't exist in Jackson County. And so it's all online anyway, so that's getting better. But the Citizen Times used to have a great State House reporter named Kira Bolton. They have none now. Winston-Salem Journal, I don't believe they have anybody in the State House press corps.
That's my knowledge.
Yeah, I don't think so. So it's not great, but I think it is still better than other states, and I still think there are ways to do it in the West that mirror in some ways here. Spectrum News, good or bad, you may not like them, but they are trying to have a statewide footprint, and I think they do a better job than most of trying to cover state politics and putting those messages out west and east.
You talk a lot in this book about something that sounds boring but is really important, which is legislative professionalism. What is that, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so maybe we'll play the audience participation game again. So actually, I want the other people to ask them a number. So I did a survey years ago, and I just said, hey, and I'll talk about this in the book. I surveyed folks in North Carolina, California, New Hampshire, and the fourth state that I can't think of all of a sudden. And I said, hey, how much do you think your state legislators make? How much money? And the numbers were radically off. And so the number in North Carolina is $13,951 a year to be a state legislator in the most powerful, as we talked about, powerful branch of government, right? Way more powerful than the governor, no question about it. We pay them $13,951 a year. And then we give them, somebody always points this out, yes, they get a per diem. It's $104 a day. I'm staying at the Hampton Inn in Carborough. It ain't that nice, and it costs more than $104 a day, right? So it's not enough. And so the professionalism is how much money they make. It is how long they're in session. North Carolina is weird as hell. We have a long session and a short session, but there's no statute that says that the long session actually has to be longer than the short session. So there's 1 year in which those two things were reversed. And the third component is staffing. So more staff, you tend to get a more professional legislature. And the idea is that if you have more of any of those three things, you're more professional. We have the 9th biggest state in the country. We have a very powerful legislature, and we score very low on the state legislative professionalism scale. So that means that, one, we get fewer women in office than states that tend to have more professional state legislatures. It also means lobbyists have way more power, right? You can imagine if you have an army of 10 staffers and you need to know something about, some arcane healthcare bill, health policy, you go to a staffer. If you have one staff member, you go to a lobbyist, right? Because they're the ones who actually know what's happening. So we've created this system where we give way more power to this group and then we give them the least amount of resources almost imaginable. And I think folks don't know that. There's a state legislator named Lindsay Prather, is in House District 115, one of the most competitive in the state in Buncombe County. And I was talking to her. She was getting mailers run against her because she said she should make more than $13,951 a year. Like the mailers said, Lindsay Prather wants to give herself a raise. And it was like her with some button that said like, I'm doing it for me. But she makes $14,000 a year. She deserves a raise, right? And so she actually gave an interview for this book where I said, how do you do it? Like, how do you make this work? And she says, look, I got a job at UNCA that allows me to go part-time. She said, I have a family who lives in the Triangle, lets me stay in their basement. I don't have a kid, and I have an understanding spouse. And that should not be the prerequisites to run for office for the most powerful branch of government in the state of North Carolina.
There's a quote in the book from a lobbyist named Joe Stewart. He says, what a lobbyist brings to the public policy business is akin to what an architect does in the construction of a building. And this is wild to me and outrageous. I mean, like, an architect is, who hires an architect? Right. The client. And the client is, we would like to imagine the client as the taxpayer. Uh-huh. But this really kind of bears the way lobbyists function in the General Assembly, I guess.
Yeah. So, like, some of the most interesting conversations I had that are in the book and otherwise just are with lobbyists. Like, I don't think we realize how much power these folks, they're not scurrilous, horrible people. Like, I think we tend to think, oh, lobbyists are all horrible. They're not all horrible. They're trying to, look, I mountain bike a lot. I want somebody to, like, get me better trails. I kayak. I want somebody to help me get river access. Like, these are not horrible people, but they're the ones oftentimes writing bills in the General Assembly. They're the ones shopping bills to certain sponsors. They're the ones who get to decide who promotes things and who doesn't promote things. And yet, almost, even in this crowd, except for the ones of y'all who've been lobbyists, there's a couple here, but except for the ones who've been lobbyists, you probably can't name a lobbyist. Yet they're the ones that are exerting a huge amount of power. And now we have a system where many of those lobbyists are getting, like we have a lobbyist on our board of trustees at Western Carolina University. UNC Chapel Hill has lobbyists that are on their board of trustees, right? So you've got these really complex and sometimes scary relationships.
Yeah, I mean, we think of lobbyists maybe in common parlance as being representing shadowy special interests. And there's like counties that have lobbyists, even as they have elected representatives. You posted on social media the other day that one of your favorite assignments is to ask students to find the most surprising group that has a lobbyist in the General Assembly. And I'm curious what some of the best answers you've gotten for that are.
Usually they're about fake weed. So the fake weed lobby is active in North Carolina politics. Buc-ee's is a good one, right? So Buc-ee's is paying lobbyists. All sorts of gambling interests that the students find, that are very, very interesting. I'm trying to think what else. Some like groups that are trying to make it cooler for you to walk around naked if you feel like it in certain places. I mean, it's wild. Like, it's the most interesting phone book you've ever read. If you ever want to come through the lobbying directory, you can find every principal, which is a fancy word for the people who are paying the money, and then you can find every one of the lobbyists. You can see who works for who. And that the Buncombe County example of counties paying, to me, is really interesting because the Buncombe County is paying more money to lobbyists than the state of North Carolina pays to the 3 members of the General Assembly who represent Buncombe County. Like, it's bananas, right?
And why are they doing that?
They're doing that because the 3 members of the General Assembly who represent Buncombe County are Democrats. And who controls the General Assembly? Republicans. So if they want to get something from the state government, they think they better pay somebody who has more power. And they've made the decision that people who have more power are the lobbyists.
We mentioned the week governor's office. When did the veto start North Carolina again?
So North Carolina was it was 100 years past every other state in the country. So it's in the early 1990s.
Right. And why does it come about then after this long tradition?
Yeah. So I mean, part of it was this partisan thing. So we had Democrats controlled everything for a long time. Then the Republicans were starting to gain a little bit of power. They gained it first at the gubernatorial level. And so when they were able to do that, we finally decided maybe we needed to give a little bit more power to the governor. And then probably my favorite sort of ironic story in North Carolina politics is that we create this veto. We do it 100 years past every other state. It takes forever. We have 3 different proposals on the floor, and the proposal that finally wins is a proposal that gives the governor the veto power, but it's incredibly weak, right? So our governor gets no veto over constitutional amendments, as we've seen on our ballot this time. The governor gets no veto on local bills. Something sounds like super boring, but if you give me a minute, I'll try to make the case that's interesting. And the third one is redistricting maps. So just ask yourself, like, all this redistricting litigation, like, what would have happened if the governor could veto those maps? And then the ironic twist, I promised, is that super weak veto was proposed by a Nash County state senator named Roy Cooper. So, like, current Roy Cooper, I got to think, like, wants to go back in time and throttle old Roy Cooper for not giving him more power. Can you imagine if Roy Cooper had power, again, to veto redistricting maps alone? It'd be a radically different state.
Unfortunately for you guys, I think local bills are really interesting. So make us the sell.
Yeah. All right. So local bills, if you can stay away from the beginning, it'll get good. All right. So local bills don't go to the governor's desk for veto. So nobody pays attention to them. They have to affect a small number of counties, and they don't get veto power. And our great State House Press Corps, which we have some here today, tend to not cover them because, like, who would cover a de-annexation in Madison County? Like, I'm bored already. But what the General Assembly is doing that's genius is they are slowly remaking our state's elections through local bills. So they're doing this. There are way more Republican counties than Democratic counties, right? Because the way the rural-urban divide has happened in our state, we have a bunch of small counties. And so if you've got, I'll give you a good example. Haywood County, there's a mayor of Canton, North Carolina, named Zeb Smathers, and he looks like an extra from Top Gun. And so Zeb is a Democrat, but he doesn't run on a Democratic ballot. He runs on a nonpartisan ballot. So people aren't reminded that Zeb is a Democrat when they go to vote. So if you are the Republican Party and you want to get rid of the Zeb Smathers of the world, and you want to create a better farm team, how would you do that? Well, you would change local elections from nonpartisan to partisan affairs. And then you take out these local Democrats who are winning in some of these places where people don't know they're Democrats. And so they've done this in multiple counties throughout the state. And it's worked, and it's genius, and nobody's watching. And nobody's watching because the governor doesn't make a big deal about it. And even the General Assembly, like we had one actually come out of Haywood County that finally failed, but for a lot of procedural reason. But when it came out, Tim Boer said, okay, we have here's what we're going to vote on today, and here's what's important, and then we also have some local bills. Like, they don't even introduce them like they matter. It's a genius way to change the state when nobody's watching.
So we can see why Roy Cooper would want to have a stronger veto. But in the book, you also write that it would be a good governance solution. Why is that?
Yeah, it is completely outside the amount of power we think the governor has, right? So again, this crowd is different, but if I ask, my class, who's the governor of North Carolina? Roy Cooper. If I ask them who their state legislator is, crickets. And so we think this one person has the power, and they don't at all. And so we need to have some check on the other branch of government. I think we needed it when the Democrats were in charge for 100 years, and sometimes the Republicans would win the governor's mansion, and we need a check today, and particularly because the Republicans have taken over the state Supreme Court. They've got 2 branches of government. The only place right now the Democrats have a chance is the governor's mansion. That's not a partisan answer. It's not because I think we need Democratic Party politics. It's because I think we need 2-party politics, and right now we're not getting them in any sort of consistent way.
So related to that, you also advocate for an independent redistricting commission. Once again, we can see why a Democrat would want that.
Right.
But why is that good? Why should Republicans want that? And why should unaffiliated North Carolinians want that?
So we're actually having a good conversation about that before we started, right? So the first person to introduce a bill in the North Carolina General Assembly for independent redistricting. So the Republicans in the room are going to like this name. The Democrats in this room, this is the you're not going to like this name. Art Pope. Art Pope introduced the first independent redistricting bill in the state of North Carolina, right? It's a people and power problem. It's not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. And so I think the Republican Party should like it, one, because it is popular. It's popular with the people. Also because if we're this far out from the next time we're going to have new maps, I think the odds that those folks are still going to be in office are lower, right? So you're sort of taking the personal out of it a little bit. It's a tough sell. So I have in the end sort of 5 things that I think will make the state better. It's the hardest political sell. I totally understand that. I still think it's worth doing. I think it would give us fair maps, not fair. I mean, it would give us more compact maps. It would give us more competitive maps. I think ultimately it would make for better Republicans and better Democrats because people would have to run offices. I understand the resistance from the Republican Party. If I had tons of power, I might have the same resistance too, just like the Democrats did when they could have done something about it. But I really believe it would make the state better.
So I want to take some audience questions in a minute. So start thinking about your questions. If you don't come up with them, Chris and I will start talking about Americana. Yeah. Only Jason wants to hear that. So while y'all are thinking about that, Mark Robinson, he's come up. He's an interesting character in a lot of ways. But as a product of North Carolina politics, how do we end up with somebody like Mark Robinson running for governor?
Yeah.
And as lieutenant governor?
Yeah, I mean, primaries is my not that great answer, but it really primary elections are what matters. And so we state level, we do get competitive elections, right? But our things in districts aren't that competitive anymore. And so the real action is in the primaries. And so I've been reading a lot about Mark Robinson's rise lately. Mark Robinson first, he gives a speech, right, at the Greensboro City Council. He says he likes guns and he thinks the gun show's cool in Greensboro, and that's fine. And then it goes viral. And it goes viral because a sitting member of Congress, decides that he wants to put it on his Facebook page. It then gets like 1 million hits, I think it was. And then I started tracing the newspaper accounts at the time. It's like over 3 months, he goes from, better than this, but essentially guy who spoke at the Greensboro City Council to gun rights advocate. Like the tag on him changed like almost overnight. And then he starts getting more, speaking engagements. Next thing you know, right, here's this guy who seems to have credentials, even though he doesn't. Then he runs in a crowded lieutenant governor's field. Republicans don't think he's going to win, and he pulls it out. They had just changed the runoff threshold. Now I'm like super wonky, I know. But they just changed the runoff threshold. If we'd had the old runoff threshold, would have had a runoff, we probably would have lost in the runoff, frankly. But he didn't. And so he won in this crowded field. The Democrats, the newspaper accounts at the time are great because the Democrats are like, we got this. Yvonne Holiday's going to win. She's super qualified. Well, Mark Robinson obviously ends up winning. And so the primary was what made the whole thing happen, right? Think about what led to Madison Cawthorn, right? The primary was the thing that made it happen. So just like I think we need to pay more attention to state politics, because it's where our voice means something, but, voting in the primary is the place for action.
Sorry, one more. Who's going to win on Tuesday?
Let's see. Who's going to win on Tuesday? Steve Troxler is going to win for North Carolina agriculture. Yeah. I know that's the racing mandate, so that's the one I go with.
Oh, I thought I could get that one past you. Oh, well. Okay, who's got a question?
Is there any place in the state that has ranked choice voting? And does that have a chance statewide at all?
Yeah, so brief point for the Assembly. I wrote a little piece in the Assembly about ranked choice voting, actually. So we experimented with it in North Carolina. It's kind of, I think it's a marginally interesting story. If you're here, you might too. So the General Assembly, when the Democrats were still in charge, said, hey, maybe we're going to try ranked choice voting. And so they said 10 counties, 10 cities, y'all can, pick whoever wants in, like put out a lottery, basically. And 2 places said they were interested. Cary and Hendersonville. That's it. Okay? Cary tried it. Hendersonville tried it. In Cary, anybody live in Cary by any chance, or live in Cary then? Like, I say a fair bit of stuff publicly. Like, I've never said anything in public that got me into so much hot water as saying something sort of positive about ranked choice voting once. Like, people are fired up, particularly in Cary. They think it was people say it's an unmitigated disaster. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. The polling data looked pretty good on it. The polling data in Henderson County actually looked pretty good on it too. And so the idea was this would be a test. The General Assembly would then report back and you'd say, did it work, did it not work? And so they reported back, and the General Assembly said, that's very nice. And that's the last time we had that conversation, and the window closed. And so right now, it's not legal to do in the state of North Carolina. I don't have a lot of faith that we're going to be able to revive it because it's become coded so quickly as partisan, right? Sarah Palin made that possible after Alaska went with ranked choice voting, and she said, this thing's horrible, it cost me the election. And I think Republicans turned against it, Democrats turned for it at the same time. I think it is oversold by some advocates. I don't think it's a cure-all to American democracy. I don't think it's going to solve polarization, but I do think perhaps it's something worth looking at. Talk more if you want to. But yeah, we have had it. We tried it. It worked with a little bit of an asterisk. And as Rob Ritchie, who's the head of this group, it's probably the most prominent RCV advocate in the country, I asked him about it, and he said it's the lessons of early mistakes, because he thought the rollout didn't go as well as he thought it would. And I said, well, what do you think the future is of it in North Carolina? And he was like, we're looking at California.
But the counties can't just say we're doing this now. It has to have the sanction of the.
Yep. That's right. Yes, partly because we're this legislature first state. And Missouri right now has on their ballot, we have the citizens only thing on our ballot. Missouri has a citizens only, and it's basically citizens only plus ranked choice voting sucks. It's like it's their ballot. They're voting on at the same time. In the same ballot question, not even like two ballot questions. It's a double-barreled, we think only citizens should vote. Oh yeah, and by the way, no ranked choice voting, no how, no ever.
Yeah, so I went to vote last week, and all over the polling place, they had a vote tally of how many early votes there had been in North Carolina as of that day, and I think they're updating it daily. But I was wondering if you've had a chance to analyze the numbers so far and what you think that tells about the story of this election in 2024 in North Carolina versus 2020.
Great. Rowan Whitney was born, and now here she is here. This is awesome. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time taking our emails about this earlier today, I think it was. We had 3.1 million people that have cast a vote in the state of North Carolina early. So it is sort of a record. In terms of raw numbers, it's a record, but of course the state's growing. So in terms of proportion, it's not really a record. But whatever, it's a big number. And what's been really interesting, we were having this conversation before, what we're used to in North Carolina and in every other state, frankly, is the Democrats tend to use early voting, and much more so than the Republicans. That's been flipped on its head. So we've seen Republicans, in terms of raw numbers and in terms of proportions, outvote Democrats in early voting. There's only 5 counties in the state where the Democrats are outperforming the Republicans by more than 5 percentage points. All right, Orange County is one of them. Buncombe County is another one. So it's totally flipped on its head. The question, and African-American turnout's down a little bit. The gender gap looks a little bit more pro-female, and then the other piece is unaffiliated voting is up a little. So what does it mean for the worst answer ever? I don't know. The reason I don't know is because we don't really have a good sense yet whether these Republican voters are, the phrase whether they're cannibalizing their own vote, which sounds way worse than it is. It's a positive for the Republican Party. But whether these are people who would have already voted on election day, and now they're just voting early, and that maybe that is creating this sort of dwarfed effect. But we're not going to know until we know the other side of the equation, right? Until we know what happens on election day. The Helene counties, usually somebody wants to ask about that. Right now they're voting roughly on par with the rest of the state, which is good news. The slightly bad news, Ted, because I can't just give a clear answer evidently, is that the Helene counties tend to overperform. And so right now they're not overperforming. So like you have one vantage point and you say, Helene has had no effect. And then you have another vantage point and you say, well, usually these counties overperform the rest of the state and they're not doing that. So maybe it's having some depressing effect.
Is there a thought about increasing the what you need to win a primary? I mean, the numbers have been going down. We have plurality primaries, right? That's the other thing. You don't have to get a majority. And it's gone down rather than up. Is there any way on earth we can get it to go the other direction? So you at least have to have, if not a majority, at least some sort of larger number than 30%.
Yeah, I doubt it, 'cause we have, as you pointed out very well, gone the opposite direction, right? So first of all, runoffs in general, it's like RC Cola. They only do it in the South, right? So the South has runoffs. They put it in when it was democratically controlled South, essentially to disenfranchise African American voters. There's no other way to say it. But it's stayed around over the years as the South moved from one party Dem to whatever you want to define us as today. North Carolina had 50%, then we dropped it to 40%, then we dropped it to 30%. As it sounds like you know. Well, I don't see much movement. I've heard a little bit of rumbling that maybe they might want to crank that back up. I doubt it will happen. I mean, the runoffs were really interesting this time, right? We saw two different for Council of State and for Congress. We saw two flipped runoffs, so they do still matter, and I think they are still giving the party what they want. So maybe folks would increase it, but I doubt there's a lot of movement there.
For those of us who went to high school in other states, how well does North Carolina's secondary education system prepare knowledge for civics and government?
And good question.
Yeah, great question, but I'm probably not the best person. I bet there are people in this room who are way better than me to answer. I mean, my sense is that civics education doesn't get a very prominent place in North Carolina. Just, we don't have, if you're a social science ed major, for example, at Western Carolina University, you grab one random university that I know. If you want to be social science ed, you have to be a history major. You can't be political science. And I love history. My wife's a historian. It's a great discipline, Brandon. But I don't know that we're even training the teachers with a lot of civics knowledge and a lot of government knowledge. And folks who went to high school in the state recently can, I'm sure, weigh in on that better than me.
Can I add something to that? They started to deprioritize civics education in North Carolina after the 1990s. I was that last cohort to have a rigorous civics education in ninth grade.
And it's why he's successful today. I will say the system, anybody wants to, we can talk about it later, the system has actually, UNC system is trying to put in some civic standards for certain courses. I believe it might be the subject of a fine honors thesis coming up soon at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But anyway, so there's been some movement at the higher ed system.
What do you think is behind so many young people deciding to be unaffiliated?
Yeah, great question. What's behind so many young people decide to be unaffiliated? Part of the answer, I think, is structural. It really is this: you can choose your own adventure in the primary, so why wouldn't you? And so I'm not doing it this cycle. I try to be a poll worker every cycle, so I was in the primaries. And we listen to poll workers when they greet new voters. Oftentimes, poll workers will tell new voters, if you pick this one, you can choose your own primary. Right? And so I think part of it is choice. I think part of it is, and I actually do not mean this as a joke, like if you have a listed party affiliation, first it's findable. And let's say you're a young person and you want to date somebody. You're locking out half the population. If you want a job, so in our MPA program, we have a lot of folks who become town managers. Well, if you're a town manager and you have a D next to your name, good luck getting hired in Swain County by the Swain County Commission, right? It's not going to happen. So I think part of it is social. I think part of it is it's a group that doesn't want to join in general in quite as big numbers. And I think part of it is strategic.
Is there like a social role that parties used to play that they no longer do?
For sure. And I think it's again, I'm registered unaffiliated, so it's not that I think it's evil or something, but I worry that we don't have it, right? That our parties are getting weaker, or recent book calls them hollow parties, which I like that a lot, right? So the idea is we have this shell and there's really nothing inside. Another way that I've heard people say is we have strong partisanship but weak parties, right? So all this work that parties used to do, it's not happening. So young people don't see, the ones I talk to anyway, don't see the party as the way to do it. I have students who are fired up about politics or making a difference in the world. They're like, how do I do it? And I'll say, like, well, are you Republican or Democrat? And join the local party. And they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, that's not how to do it. And there's this, actually be interested, the Republican friends in the room to talk to you about this. There's been a movement I've noticed on college campuses where there's fewer and fewer college Republicans and more Turning Points chapters. And I think it's a real problem for democracy, right? Nobody ever ran for office for the Turning Point party. And so, I think there's a lot of reasons. Turning Point has a lot of money. They'll send you to good conferences, all that kind of thing. But I think it's a real issue, actually, for organizing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on that, but it's also happening on the national level. Like, the national parties, they just don't play the role that they used to. You know, Elon Musk, George Soros, all these super PACs out there, right, that are just banks. I mean, they're primarily banks to run advertising for and accept money. And the party just doesn't have the role that it had, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Look, I'm in the industry, but it's about money. Like you see what George Soros and those groups and Democrat groups are doing, and allied groups, and what Republican, the Koch brothers and all them are doing as well. And talk about Turning Point and stuff like that.
Yep, that's great.
I have a question. I really enjoyed the book that you edited with Gibbs Knotts, The New Politics of North Carolina. One of the contributions, the chapters, talks about the weak governorship and how governors who have certain charisma and an ability to use the bully pulpit can still get a lot out of the office, even if it has little institutional power. That's on my mind because we're almost at the 100th year anniversary that modern North Carolina state bureaucracy was reinvented under Oliver Max Gardner during the 1930s, at the same time that Roosevelt is doing the same thing at the federal level.
Right.
So if you look at all the governors since Oliver Max Gardner in 1932 through Roy Cooper, are there any, maybe 3 governors that you think really stand out in terms of getting the most out of that weak office and transforming the state of North Carolina in a way that governors typically do not?
Great question, Brandon. Jim Martin comes to mind, right, for historical, for a whole host of reasons, actually, right? Here's a Republican who did well in an environment where you might not have expected, and I think modern Republican Party owes a lot. Jim Hunt would be an obvious answer, right? So we used to also have in North Carolina, you didn't used to be able to succeed yourself, right? So you just get one term and out. And then so Jim Hunt said, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe we need to have it so you can succeed yourself. And guess who the first person to do that was? Jim Hunt. Oh, and by the way, you can do it multiple times as long as you take a breather after your 8th year. So who knows what'll happen? We might have Governor Cooper again in North Carolina after 4 years. I don't think so, but stranger things have happened. So those 2 immediately come to mind. Recency bias you could accuse me of, but I'd say Roy Cooper perhaps for another in an extremely difficult environment in ways that some folks loved and some folks did not, was able to still exert some power in our state. So maybe those 3, but with a real emphasis on Martin and Hunt. Where
would you put Carr Scott and Terry Sanford in that analysis?
I read Rob Christensen's book, so I'll put Carr Scott high. So if you've read Rob's second book, you get that joke. If you didn't, you should. But yeah, I think probably pretty high. Actually, Sanford's probably a better answer than Cooper, actually, come to think of it. So I'll grab your Sanford answer and drop my Cooper.
Yeah, really rudimentary question coming from an admittedly completely ignorant person about North Carolina government. What is the historical reason Chris, for the weak and the relatively powerless assembly, state assembly.
So the assembly, I mean, my argument is the General Assembly is actually the very powerful. Yeah, so we govern in strong General Assembly. Oh, you mean the professionalism piece? I'm sorry.
Both. I thought I heard you, maybe I heard an inversion. I thought that you had said that the assembly was weak compared to the rest of the country.
No, I might have, I misspeak frequently, so maybe I misspoke. So the argument I'm making is that the General Assembly is the one with the power but without the resources, right? So we've had 3 constitutions in the state of North Carolina. All 3 have defined the General Assembly as being not even the first among equals, just the first, really. And so it's been like that literally since
Precedes the Declaration of Independence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this is also, you tend to see this a lot in the South, that you see these kind of very powerful legislatures often, but without the resources. And we've been arguing this resource issue for a long time. So I traced some of the book about efforts in the 1940s to increase state legislative pay. So we've been having this conversation for a very long time to essentially no effect.
And this professionalism, picking up on the professionalism of, what was the terminology, professionalized?
Legislative professionalism.
Legislative professionalism. I'm just intuiting, these are people who have other jobs that are there.
You intuit well. Yes, so they often have other jobs, right? And then, I mean, it's like to ask folks to think about what kinds of jobs, what could you do and make $14,000 a year on an irregular schedule? And the answer is retired people, obviously.
Yes.
It's like there's a guy, my state senator, he's a guy named Kevin Corbin. He's a Republican state senator. He's won a number of terms. He's about to win another. He runs an insurance practice in downtown Franklin, North Carolina. That's the kind of job you can have, right? But, you know, if you want to be, it basically means if you are a high school teacher, you cannot serve in the General Assembly, right? Because there's no way just to leave your job for that long, and you can't live off $14,000 a year. So it sets up some real issues for who actually ends up serving, what kinds of jobs, and again, the idea that very consistently more professional legislatures tend to get more women in office than these less professional legislatures do.
Let's see if we can get in 1 or 2 more questions. Wait.
Oh, you just had us set it up so we
Great.
Do you see any scenario where, and I don't know whether it would be the state legislature or the Secretary of State, could potentially in this election refuse to certify the popular vote for president in North Carolina?
Yeah, so I mean, this was floated, right, by the head of the Freedom Caucus, and I was somewhat gratified to see it get stomped down quickly, appropriately, and in some cases violently. Right, so Patrick McHenry, right, very powerful former brief Speaker of the House, he of the big gavel, he said, this is what you do in the visit, he said, basically, this isn't going to happen. And then if you're Southerners who get this, then he said, bless your heart.
Right.
So you know, right, if you're in the South and you say, bless your heart, that means go to hell. So I don't see that happening. I have a lot of fears about this election. I have a lot of fears about what could happen. That one doesn't tend to be one of them that I'm high on my list yet. And feel free to remind me if it happens.
If I can come and candid about this particular issue, because I'm really interested to know, get some perspective on it, because I moved over in the mid-90s with the tech boom, and back then, you know, you couldn't type and search where you were going. It was really a sort of leap of faith back then, and because we were building it. But when I came over, I was honestly very shocked about attitudes to race and gender. I found it really shocking, and I found it really. I remember when Hillary Clinton was chastised because she didn't like to make cookies or something, and then just a couple of weeks ago, I heard sort of a Republican woman say, "Well, Kamala's doing women no favors by showing that she can cook on YouTube or something." So you can't win. But I find it fascinating. Michelle Obama did an amazing speech, and a fantastic speech, and she really actually lifted up women's voice. And I have 2 daughters, and I'm very worried about what is happening. And I found it so interesting watching Kamala and Liz Cheney together talking, and I'm wondering what you think, how that will impact North Carolina by seeing sort of a conservative woman standing up for these pro-choice rights, and we shouldn't call it abortion. We should call it, it's reproductive health through the lifespan of a woman, because a woman's body is unique and different. There's a lot more processes.
No, it's great. Great points. I mean, I don't know that Liz Cheney's going to change a lot of minds. Really? From folks on the right. There are. I think once she broke with the party, she lost a lot of credibility. Arguably this the right thing to do and all that, but I think she really did. So I don't see that as being a big game changer. And we have some of the same kinds of issues in North Carolina. We have a number of very prominent Republicans who have broken with the Republican Party over a number of issues, Trump namely, and they've lost credibility with the Republican Party, and we'll admit that freely, actually. I'm thinking about Bob Orr, former state Chief Justice, or not Chief Justice, but former state Supreme Court Justice, who was a Republican, went unaffiliated, was on stage recently when Kamala Harris came to Asheville, and every Republican I talked to said, well, I don't consider Bob Orr a Republican anyway, so all I see is a Democrat on stage with another Democrat. And my sense is that's how Republicans view Dick Cheney, excuse me. Although you actually could add Dick Cheney, because he endorsed it too. So, but Liz Cheney at this point. So I don't know that. The other piece about the gender politics of this election, I mean, I do think it's potentially critical. We are seeing increased women right now turning. So the early voting data are, interesting tea leaves, weird tea leaves sometimes, but you are seeing pretty good turnout among women. And I think we're seeing, at least some studies show, larger gender gaps than we've seen during the last few cycles. So I don't have a great answer to your question, but I do think it's one of the dynamics I'm absolutely watching over the next week, and then the weeks after we try to figure out what happened.
Because she just smoking her noses in the voting booth. It's just so interesting how she was really targeting conservative women. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love North Carolina. I'm still here.
Sure.
I love the state. But those things need to change.
That's great.
I think I should have left more time for audience questions, because you guys had some wonderful questions. It is time for us to wrap up. If you haven't picked up a copy of the book, please do that. I bet you can buttonhole Chris afterwards here. Just a guess. Thank you so much for being a great audience. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Chris.